China, the Chinese government is going to have to relocate the capital from northern China to somewhere in the south. Say Nanjing, back to the Kuomintang capital. That impact, what impact is that going to have on real estate values? It's going to be a huge impact. The wealth effect would be just unimaginable. Trillions and trillions of RMB in real estate investment has been sunk into Beijing. And if the capital moves, and of course Beijing is valuable because it is the national capital. And so if the capital moves to southern China, which is a radical proposal which some academics have proposed, and I don't think it's really that unimaginable. I mean, if they literally run out of water, there's no water for drinking for, there's got those 15, 20 million people in Beijing, you're going to have to move. There's no other choice. So these are potential huge shocks that await China. I think China is far from out of the woods. So as I said before, I think in terms of external shocks, the US still has to step in, basically, as the coordinator. I mean, the US may not dominate foreign policy in Asia anymore, but someone needs to solve the collective action problem. And I think the US, as still the largest armed force in the world, needs to step in and solve the collective action problem for problems like, what happens if North Korea collapses. Internal problems, obviously China will have to deal with these problems. And of course the US stands ready to give technical assistance and if necessary humanitarian assistance. China has a lot of money now, but that money can be spent extremely rapidly. And this is something that we see in Russia. So Russia had, again, a huge foreign exchange reserve, and they spent 50% of it in less than half a year, basically. Of course, they had to defend their currency, which was stupid. But in China, talk about diversification of the FX portfolio in China, China's foreign exchange reserve. The biggest expenditure now, sort of diversifying away from the dollar, is in China itself. So the CIC has actually spent untold billions of dollars defending the share prices of Chinese state-owned banks. It's because the CIC, China Investment Corporation, which is the sovereign wealth fund of China, owns a large portfolio of shares of Chinese banks. And basically in the Hong Kong market and also in the Asia market in mainland, people just don't believe in Chinese banks anymore. I mean, you have Chinese banks lending to these hugely inefficient, with no cash flow kind of government projects. There's going to be large non-performing loans. So speculators are shorting Chinese banks, and the CIC is stepping in to defend the share prices of Chinese banks. And that's sort of in a way a diversification, but they're basically saving their own ass, more or less. So that's how they're spending money. And then this money can go very quickly. And this means also that if there are big shocks in China, China's ability to buy US bonds will also decrease. And also their own willingness, right? So the United States getting a huge amount of debt. And recently I see this very disturbing trend that actually the yield for US bonds, long-term yield, 10 years, 20 years, has gone up. And so short-term yield's gone down to 0 or whatever, but long-term yield has gone up. That means people's faith in the long-term financial solvency of the US government is declining, right? And this will especially go up if China faces severe shocks, which necessitate the diversion of huge amount of resources for domestic expenditure. I think there are a lot of worries about China in the future. For external things, I think the US can step in to do some stuff, to coordinate some stuff. But internal challenges, China will mostly have to face themselves. But we in the United States should prepare for these eventualities and come up with our own proposals to deal with, what happens if China undergoes a severe internal shock. Thank you.
And majoring in economics. Professor Shih, you mentioned that there's a lot of inefficiency in Chinese sovereign wealth fund, and you said that those investments made by the state are they can do they can do really big public projects, and you say that's really inefficient. I didn't see why, because if they have to pass through a certain legislation process, you have to spend a lot of money on that too. So why is that so inefficient? And other things is that you mentioned that a lot of speculators are shorting Chinese banks, meaning they have no confidence in the Chinese banks. But at the same time, those speculators in the world are shorting U.S. banks too. What do you think about that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, speculators will just short whatever bank companies there are out there. So, yeah, U.S. banks are bad companies. I don't think anything of it. Also, about public infrastructure. So, to be sure, not all public infrastructure is useless, definitely. But for example, you take the example of the Three Gorges Dam, which cost trillions of renminbi to build. Basically, we've done these exercises where, like, if we don't build, a couple stadiums in Beijing for the Olympics, how many generations of children we can educate, and these figures will astonish you. If we don't build the Three Gorges Dam, basically, 15 years of school kids who have gone to school for free. But instead, you have this huge, gigantic dam, which produces a lot of electricity, granted, but electricity prices fluctuates tremendously. Sometimes it's basically worthless. And also, the Three Gorges Dam is a bad design, so it's silting up. So a lot of scientists say that within 20, 30 years, it's going to silt up so much that it's basically going to be worthless, right? So these projects, of course, did not undergo this process of public hearings, which would happen in the United States, where you have experts speak against these projects. There were a lot of experts who were against the project, but of course the Chinese government didn't allow them to have any voice because the Three Gorges Dam was the pet project of Premier Li Peng. So it was built. Costing trillions of renminbi, but the economic value of it is very unclear at this point. And in fact, during some periods it was producing surplus electricity. And so the central government actually had to order Guangdong to buy electricity from the Three Gorges Dam, even though it didn't want to, because it's built already, so it has to be useful. That's the kind of inefficiency I'm talking about.
Any other questions?
Just a quick follow-up. I managed to realize I skipped a line in my remarks about technologies in China that are relevant, paper money. But just following up on government allocation of capital involving banks, I've done some work with Thailand on this, where they've gotten in a lot of trouble where you have quasi-private banks and you've got government agencies that borrow from those banks, and the government agencies have a great deal of influence, and so they can get loans approved that a private group could never get from a bank. That that government agencies can pull levers the highest parts of government to get these loans made, and then once the loans are made, if the project isn't working out very well, you can't really shut them down because they've they're enlisting high, powerful government people, and so rather than getting paid off, you actually have to lend them more money to keep them going, because otherwise you have to come out and say, oh, they're in default, and you really don't offend people who are powerful by doing that. And also you sort of get yourself in financial trouble by saying, yes, a large part of our portfolio is in default, and so you're saying, oh, it's just fine, and we're actually expanding and lending them more money. And so that when government is involved in this capital allocation process, you often get really bad outcomes.
Sorry. So, yeah, thank you for your sharing. I have a question for Professor Shih. When you talk about how the 80s data is 50% GPA or something like that, but back to the era, back to the era, anything could happen. Government control, what kind of, what kind of information do we spread out to the world? I don't understand how you could compare that kind of data to what is right now is scientific and very justified data.
Oh, data back then.